don't think I'll ever forget the first time I saw Resident Evil 2, because it was also the first time I'd ever seen a PlayStation. I was only 9 or 10 at the time, but no stranger to video games. My mother played a Nintendo NES when she was pregnant with me. I grew up playing Super Mario and Duck Hunt. At some point after that, I got a Sega Genesis and Sega Game Gear, and I had Sonic for both of those. But seeing Resident Evil 2 on a PlayStation changed the way I saw video games forever. I was visiting my half-brother, who's a couple years older than me, and I walked back and saw him playing a console that I'd never seen before. It looked more realistic than any game I'd ever seen. It was like playing a horror movie. After I remarked at how real it was, he was excited to show it to me from the beginning, and so he started a new game, and my jaw hit the floor again. The beginning of the game was like an animated Hollywood movie. Everything about it was cinematic. The lighting, the audio, even the pacing. The shock of the zombie hiding in the back seat, crashing police cruiser, culminating in the exploding tanker truck. This was pretty much the coolest thing I had ever seen in my life, and I only knew one thing for certain, that I needed a Sony PlayStation. I would argue that PlayStation wasn't just influential on me, it changed how video games would be made forever. Some people may not realize that the PlayStation began as a joint venture between Nintendo and Sony in 1988. Sony engineer Ken Kutaragi watched his young daughter playing Nintendo Famicom, as it was known in Japan. Being an engineer for Sony, a company known for audio technology, he took note of the low quality of the sound. Ken would eventually end up designing a sound processor that Sony would produce for the Super Nintendo, which would lead to the joint venture in 1988. Nintendo top rival Sega had a disc-based add-on for the Genesis. Nintendo saw discs as far too slow, but also couldn't stand being left behind by Sega. 1988 saw Nintendo partner with Sony for their expertise in compact discs to develop the PlayStation as both an add-on to the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, but also a standalone product from Sony. Sony was already exclusively licensing and producing the SNES sound chip and would also control manufacturing of their disc games. However, Sony's increasing value and expansion into film and entertainment made Nintendo nervous. Nintendo then entered into talks with Sony's rival, Philips, as an alternative source for their discs. When Sony executives found out about this, they were furious, and the PlayStation deal was canceled. Yeah, that's right. Because Nintendo was paranoid, they tried to strike a secret double deal with Philips and ended up creating their most powerful enemy simply because they feared Sony's power level. PlayStation was one of the 5th generation consoles. Released in America in 1995, it would compete primarily with the Atari Jaguar, Sega Saturn, and the Nintendo 64. I can remember as a kid, we would constantly argue over PlayStation or the N64, and especially which one had the best graphics. But to me, PlayStation was the king. And I would always point to games like Resident Evil 2 as proof of this. One day, I was hit with some facts that I couldn't refute. The Nintendo 64 was a 64-bit system, and PlayStation was only a 32-bit system. Upon hearing this, I was in shock. How could the PlayStation not be better? It used awesome black discs, and the N64 used those silly archaic cartridges. I now know Nintendo 64's processor was a MIPS R4000 running at nearly 3 times the speed of the PlayStation's. But PlayStation did more with less, and it forced video game developers to make a choice that would inform how they made their games moving forward. And this is a in-depth look at the history of PlayStation, the impact it had on games, and things that made it so successful. This is going to be kind of a long one. I'm going to have the sections time-stamped down below, although I do, of course, recommend watching the entire thing. And by the way, I'm Jay. I make videos as DS Tech Media about tech. And so if you find this interesting, I ask you to like, share, and subscribe. Ken Kutaragi, the very same man who had designed the Super Nintendo sound chip, had no real interest in video games himself, but he was increasingly interested in 3D graphics and its potential applications. His interest began sometime in the second half of the 1980s when he saw a prototype from Sony's now-defunct Information Processing Research Center called System G, which was unveiled to the world in 1989 as the MDE 9000 or Multi-Digital Effects 9000, a $350,000 computer for producing 3D graphics for TV broadcast. Following the failed Nintendo deal, Sony CEO and personal friend to Ken, Norio Oga, would support Ken's new project based on what he had learned studying System G's technology. As the chief manager of the project, Kutaragi remained a key engineer designing the PlayStation's graphics chip. He really is the father of the PlayStation in a literal and figurative sense. His success with PlayStation made Sony Computer Entertainment the most profitable division of Sony and earned Ken the position of CEO of Sony Computer Entertainment in 1997. Before moving any further, I must acknowledge Rodrigo Copetti of Copetti.org. He does an amazing analysis of consoles ranging from generations 3 through 8. Many of the images I'm using are straight from his site, and his research has been a foundation for this video. The PlayStation had 2 megabytes of RAM dedicated to the processor, 1 megabyte to the GPU, and 512 kilobytes or half a megabyte to sound and disk functions. Sony designed their GPU and sound chips in-house, but would need a suitable CPU to handle the processing of data for those two chips. They worked with a company called LSI Logic, who had a program to design MIPS-based processors according to the client company's needs. This meant picking from cores to be included in the final package. The custom service was called Coreware, and the director of LSI Coreware from 1985 to 93 was Jensen Huang. After leaving LSI, he co-founded a little company you've probably never heard of called NVIDIA. Sony chose the CW33000, a MIPS R3000 paired with 3 integrated coprocessors. The system control coprocessor, which controls how the cache is implemented, thus enabling direct memory access and adding the scratch pad. The geometry transformation engine is a specialized math processor that accelerates vector and matrix calculations, taking care of the first stages of the graphics pipeline, such as 3D projection, lighting, and clipping data that will be sent to the GPU for rendering. And the final coprocessor is the MDEC, or Macro Block Decoder, aka the motion decoder. The macro block is a data structure that houses a picture similar in encoding to a JPEG. The MDEC decompresses bitmaps capable of computing 9,000 macro blocks per second. This allows streaming of full motion video at a resolution of 320 by 240 and at 30 frames per second, making those awesome CGI videos possible, which are actually just a grid of thousands of those tiny 16 by 16 macro blocks decompressed by the motion decoder. PlayStation's success is often chalked up to its simplicity, but it made 3D simple by using cutting-edge custom silicon. It was an early example of a SoC, or system-on-chip design, where the CPU and its coprocessors are made into a single die or chip. The first commercially significant example of a system-on-chip was the ARM 610 in the 1993 Apple Newton, the result of a joint venture between Acorn, Apple, and VLSI, who, like LSI Logic, pioneered custom integrated chips. For PlayStation, it meant the CPU, 3D acceleration, and video decompression all running at the same speed, and handling direct memory access for the GPU, sound, and disk. It's the secret weapon of the console. If these were all separate chips like in Sega Saturn, it wouldn't just be harder to program for, it would mean less speed and performance. Today, system-on-chips are found in every smartphone, typically integrating the CPU, GPU, wireless networking, and any number of coprocessors. While the PlayStation's custom system-on-chip was produced by LSI Logic, at its core was a MIPS R3000 licensed from MIPS Technologies, the same way Apple, Google, and Samsung smartphones use cores licensed from ARM. In the early 90s, SGI had become the industry leader in 3D graphics and animation with their high-end Irix workstations powered by MIPS processors. So successful that in 1992, SGI went from being MIPS's largest customer to their parent company. So the PlayStation and the N64's processors used the same architecture as the high-end SGI machines, used to create not only the biggest games, but also the revolutionary CGI in major Hollywood movies like Jurassic Park, Titanic, and Toy Story. So Sony chose to give the CPU 2 megabytes of extended data out RAM. This particular type of RAM has lower latency and more efficiency than others. Sony seems to prioritize premium RAM chips because it's a trend they'd continue with future consoles as well. PlayStation's 2 megabytes are connected using the 32-bit D-bus to main bus interface unit to the CPU and the video subsystem, which consists of the GPU, 1 megabyte of VRAM, and the RGB encoder. The CD-ROM controller, motion video decoder, GPU, sound processor, and parallel port have an exclusive direct memory access controller to bypass the main MIPS CPU for access to the EDO RAM, much faster than waiting for the CPU to assign data. However, if the DMA transfer is happening, the CPU cannot access main memory and it will be left idle. That is, unless it has something in the scratch pad to keep it busy. The scratch pad is a 1 kilobyte block of faster SRAM, normally used as the data cache, but instead repurposed as scratch pad in Sony's custom design. The purpose of the scratch pad is to have a more flexible cache system available to the programmer. Neither the kernel nor Sony libraries will try to make use of it. It's completely up for grabs by the programmer. This was a clever, efficient, very simple design that could be optimized by developers who took the time to plan out their coding. So LSI's Coreware system-on-chip designs allowed for a fourth coprocessor, which would have been a floating point unit or FPU. FPUs accelerate calculations with fractions and exponents for higher precision, used in 2D and 3D graphics, color, and even audio. So what does it actually do? Basically math with decimals and fractions. For example, a fixed point representation with a uniform decimal point placement convention can represent the numbers 123.45, 1234.56, 12,345.67, etc. Whereas a floating point representation could represent 1.234567, 1234567.7, or whatever. Hopefully you get the point. Here, let's try visual representation. The difference in points representing distances on this graph looks like this in fixed precision, or like this in floating point precision. Essentially, it translates to smoother graphics, animations, and effects. And today, floating point units can be found in just about any computer device with audio and video playback. But in the early 1990s, they were a premium upgrade. So why didn't Sony include one? It may have been to achieve PlayStation's $299 price tag at release. Ironically, the N64 did include an FPU, and it was released at $199 a year later than the PlayStation. But Nintendo priced the N64 to match Sony's price cut to $199. Sony could have also left the floating point unit out to keep the development as simple as possible, something that both the N64 and Sega Saturn struggled with. The PlayStation's MIPS CPU itself was a traditional 5-stage RISC pipeline, where it queues up the multiple instructions and executes them in parallel. So the main CPU GTE does a lot of the heavy lifting by doing all of the geometry math. It then sends the vertices to the GPU's 64-byte first in, first out buffer. The GPU then uses this data to draw primitives, which are triangles. The GPU then applies clipping to skip wasting time drawing operations for unseen polygons. The triangle primitive's location is defined using x, y coordinates. Each coordinate is the center of a pixel called a sampling point. The rasterizer converting the vectors into triangles and then into pixels. Everything becomes a wireframe made up of primitives. The GPU also has functions for generating sprites. Sprites are the 2D raster images that were the primary graphics assets for the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis consoles. However, many PlayStation games such as Square's Final Fantasy Tactics made extensive use of them for the character models. In the end, everything becomes a pixel map. The frame buffer is the final destination, but before that, the shader applies lighting effects to the polygon surfaces. PlayStation's GPU has two algorithms for shading: flat and Gouraud. In flat shading, each primitive has a constant light level, and with Gouraud shading, each primitive's vertex embeds its own light level. Then the brightness between each point is interpolated automatically. Flat shading fills at 2.5 times more polygons per second than Gouraud shading. The GPU's shader unit is also capable of semi-transparency, which simulates light passing through multiple textures, and dithering. The dithering algorithm softens changes in color and allows a digital image to look correct while actually using less colors. The GPU stores all of this as a frame buffer in the 1 megabyte of VRAM, along with images of textures that it will apply to the polygons using texture mapping. Finally, the shaded surfaces are blended with the textures. Copetti.org shows a shot of the frame buffer for Spyro the Dragon. However, these are super tiny resolution. So here are some other frame buffer examples from emulated PlayStation graphics engines. And finally, the PlayStation lacked any sort of texture filtering, but instead made use of the nearest neighbor algorithm as a fast and cheap way of scaling colors and edges. And here you can see a 2D texture mapped onto 3D primitives. The PlayStation used affine texture mapping, the fastest and least precise method. Only uses two-dimensional coordinates. This means the textures lacked perspective or depth, and they would often appear warped or distorted as the viewport moved by them. In computer graphics, the visibility problem is one of the main challenges, and it's about determining which polygons are visible from the viewport. Getting this wrong results in things drawn incorrectly or effects appearing broken. PlayStation's solution is via ordering tables, which give surfaces a z-index determining the order which they are drawn. Additionally, it includes direct memory access functions for both the CPU and GPU to create and traverse ordering tables. PlayStation uses an adjustable frame buffer, giving the devs the option to prioritize colors, resolution, and textures or resources as they saw fit. Max resolution is 1024 by 512, 16-bit, which would be 960 by 512 with 24-bit true color. Maximum output resolution was 640 by 480, but PlayStation was primarily designed for CRT televisions, and they would typically divide that resolution up into pages of 320 by 240 in 16-bit or 24-bit, sacrificing more memory. It could even hold and display different color depths at the same time. The two pages used page flipping, where the system renders one frame while displaying the other. The rest of the space is occupied by your color lookup tables, color depths, textures, sprites, and static images. Here's my mock-up from earlier, and here it is with some bullshit textures. And yes, as stupid as this is, I'm kind of proud of it. The PlayStation would be known for several types of errors in graphics, such as jagged edges, or aliasing wobbly polygons, or warped texture perspectives, sometimes even flickering, disappearing polygons. And all of this commonly gets blamed on PlayStation's lack of a floating point unit. However, Copetti.org seems to indicate things like flickering or occluded surfaces are the result of some developers relying on software approximations to gain performance. He also mentions that techniques like tessellation, dividing a larger polygon up into smaller ones, could have been used to reduce distortion. But I don't know enough about computer graphics, and I could be completely misinterpreting this, so if you think I got this wrong, read the article on Copetti.org and go ahead and flame me in the comments section. After everything is rasterized by the GPU, it gets sent out to the RGB or composite encoders, where it's converted to an analog TV standard. And just to say a word about analog displays, I started the video with a disclaimer about formats, resolution, and emulation because most of the footage I'm using is 1080p emulation footage that lacks PS1's quirks like wobbly polygons, distortions, and jagged edges. And I've even formatted square 4:3 aspect footage to 16:9 widescreen. Even the footage you see here is the 1998 game Heart of Darkness, painstakingly modified and edited to make it fit into a fake CRT TV. 1080p actually makes original PS1 footage look worse because we're talking about analog TV signals and 1080p displays. And I would argue that using the better footage gives you a better idea of what it looked like back in the day because we didn't have 1080p HD footage to constantly compare it to. 240p to 1080p, it's a huge difference. And so yes, it does look better than it would, and no, the footage is not from the original hardware, but it is a closer representation to the way the footage looked to me as a kid. The first generations of the PlayStation had the most video signal outputs. RFU modulator, which was the first one to get removed, the typical RCA composite video, S-Video, which provides Luma plus Sync combined and Chroma, and finally the AV multi-out, which provides all the previous signals except the RFU, plus RGB and a 5+ volt line. Later revisions removed ports, and at the end, only the AV multi-out was left. Naturally, Sony's system included a very competent sound processor capable of CD quality playback. Copetti.org describes the CD subsystem as its own computer within the PlayStation that provides direct access to the disc for reading music or video for playback. The SPU could decompress audio, and it included its own 32 kilobytes of SRAM as a buffer, as well as its own sub-CPU with 512 bytes of RAM and a 16 kilobyte ROM for the DSP, and dedicated copy protection separate from the main system. Sony's sound processor supports both PCM and ADPCM audio sources. ADPCM is adaptive differential passcode modulation, a type of PCM developed specifically for speech coding. The SPU runs at a sampling rate of 44.1 kilohertz across 24 16-bit channels. It supports live MIDI sequencing, demonstrated here in Final Fantasy VII, where you can actually play the piano, and a host of digital effects such as pitch modulation, looping, and digital reverb, as well as an ADSR envelope, like the ones found on synthesizers for shaping the attack, decay, sustain, and release. And so PlayStation offered both the streaming of high-quality audio from the disc or the ability to synthesize it in real time the way previous consoles would. Also on the back was the serial I/O port, designed specifically for the PlayStation Link cable, allowing you to connect two PlayStations together. This meant you could do multiplayer without the split single screen, assuming that both PlayStations had their own television. And lastly, there was the parallel I/O port, apparently intended to become a RAM or memory expansion port. However, Sony never released any official products that could actually use it, and it was eventually removed from the later models. However, products such as the Game Shark were created for it by third parties, unlock cheats and exploits for a huge variety of games. Later on, a product called PSIO was created that would connect to the port. This would allow you to keep your entire game library on the device, and you could even use ROM images from online. It also claims to boost the performance, since the game is being read from flash memory rather than a disc. Around front, we have two ports for the controllers, as well as up to two 128 kilobyte flash memory cards. The memory cards allowed you to backup or save your progress or customization files for games and take them with you to your friend's house, even duplicate onto other memory cards. Some games, such as Music 2000, can use memory cards as main RAM to store data for real-time processing, bypassing the 2 megabyte RAM limit by just a little bit. There was also the PlayStation Multitap, which would allow up to 4 controllers. I wish I would have known this as a kid, because N64 users would always flout the 4-player capability as a mark of superiority over the PlayStation. An enhanced version of the memory card called the Pocket Station was only available in Japan, could play mini games for an entire list of games. Sony planned to release it to Europe and North America, but it never materialized. We can't talk about the PlayStation's hardware without appreciating the controller. A crowning achievement of its own, Teiu Goto was responsible for the PlayStation 1 and its controller, and in an interview with CNET, Mr. Goto said that Sony was looking for a simple look for its console, a basic box with a circle on top for the CD-ROM. Sony emphasized that the controller should not be a radical departure from the controller for the Super Nintendo. Goto also explained the rationale behind the symbols used. The triangle refers to one's head or direction. Square refers to a piece of paper, menus, or documents. The circle and X represent yes or no in decision making. PlayStation's directional control buttons were praised for their accuracy, but the original controller was also possibly one of the missed opportunities when compared with the N64 controller's progressive features like an analog joystick and the add-on rumble pack for vibrational feedback. Thankfully, Sony realized their misstep here and in 1997 released the PlayStation DualShock, adding analog joysticks and vibrating motors located beneath them. But what truly makes the controller design special is that it has stood the test of time. Since the 1997 DualShock, the base design has changed very little. New features have been added with the PlayStation generations, but the core shape and layout have remained consistent. The PS4 was the largest change to the controller, but it's only slight nuance when compared to its contemporaries. For example, the Super Nintendo to the N64 to the GameCube, or even the Saturn to the Dreamcast. 27 years later, and the PlayStation 5 controller is still virtually the same as the DualShock released in 1997. With Sony being the new kid, they put a lot of emphasis on partnering with game studios and focused on making developing games for the PlayStation as pleasant as possible. In 1993, Sony acquired game studio Psygnosis, who were notable for developing and publishing innovative games on a range of consoles from Atari to PC. But perhaps more importantly, Psygnosis had previously worked with SN Systems to create the PsyQ development kits for various gaming systems, such as the Sega Genesis. Sony initially had provided their own news workstations with a PlayStation built in, but these were only provided to game studios who had partnered with Sony early on. Ran News OS, which was Sony's own flavor of Unix.
It's a Unix system. I know this. It's all the files of the whole park.
But Psygnosis felt a more affordable solution that worked on Windows PCs would be far better. Psygnosis arranged for SN Systems to create PC-based PlayStation dev kits, and these twin ISA boards were the result, containing the full PlayStation chipset on board along with 8 megabytes of RAM instead of 2 from the actual console. They also came with the software tools included on discs. A separate card was made available specifically for developing music and audio. They could be installed directly into Windows computers, greatly lowering the barrier of entry for developing for the PlayStation. Eventually, an even more simplified and low-cost development package was made available that used only one card and a NetYarose PlayStation debugging unit. And looking into it further, I found out Sony made a lot of other kits for PlayStation developers. I found this huge collection of PlayStation dev kits and tools, which are now collector's items. The N64 required expensive SGI machines, typically over $100,000, and the cheapest option was the SGI Indie workstation, which still cost $40K. And while many of the major PlayStation games were made using SGI machines, they weren't actually required for programming, testing, and bugging. Sony even made different kits for the different jobs available, individual single board for musicians, artists, and others. A studio could buy only what they needed in different kits for their different employees. Here you can see a room full of people using a PC, a CRT TV, and the NetYarose debugging units. To have this many people doing the same work on an N64 would cost a literal fortune in SGI machines. Nintendo had a reputation of dictating terms to their third-party game studios, and they also had a family-friendly image that they would strive to maintain. This included censoring violent or mature themes, particularly in the USA. Squaresoft, the studio that created Final Fantasy, had been a key partner with Nintendo for over a decade, with Nintendo even owning shares in the company. When Square found out the N64 was no longer going to be using discs, they immediately began internal discussions to switch consoles because their next Final Fantasy was going to be more ambitious than ever, and they were counting on increased storage capacity of the discs. Square choosing Sony shocked the gaming industry, as Sega Saturn was a huge success in Japan at the time, and Square's president Tomoyuki Takechi was childhood friends with Sega's president Shiochiro Irimajiri, and it's been speculated that Sony gave Square a discount rate on production costs of their discs, which Square would require in larger volumes since Final Fantasy VII was a 3-disc game. Sony also shared publishing and marketing rights with Square and its independent marketing company Digicube. Square was relieved to be free of Nintendo's censorship, and Final Fantasy VII would be the first in the series to be released in North America uncensored. I said before that PlayStation changed gaming forever, and that's true in several ways. The most evident example is that PlayStation changed how the game studios made games. The proof? AAA refers to major games far beyond the average in terms of budget. With its $45 million budget, Final Fantasy VII is widely acknowledged as the first real AAA game, featuring unprecedented cinematic CGI, movie-like presentation, orchestral music, and cinematic camera work. It was like nothing before it. GameRant.com's 15 most expensive games ever made still has Final Fantasy VII at number 15 on the list, over 27 years after it was released. In 1997, it was the best-selling game in the world. By 1998, it had sold 6 million copies worldwide and was directly responsible for another explosion in PlayStation console sales. And speaking of console sales, Atari 2600 was the first successful console with 30 million sales. The Nintendo Entertainment System nearly hit 62 million. Sega Genesis had 30 million, and Super Nintendo reached 49 million, and Sony's PlayStation 102 million units. Factor in the faster, cheaper, and most importantly, scalable production of discs instead of the slow and risky manufacturing of cartridges, and it's more profit and less risk per unit, and 100 million opportunities. PlayStation made video games big business. The studios and publishers made huge investments, seized the opportunity to significantly expand franchises or establish new ones. And when compared to the rest of the 5th generation consoles, it's barely a competition. Sony hit a home run on the first inning. I said PlayStation was Sony's first foray into video games, and I can already hear some of you out there saying,
What about the MSX?
Yeah, what about the MSX? The MSX was a standardized home computer architecture developed by the ASCII Corporation and Microsoft in mid-1983. Jointly marketed in Japan and other Eastern nations, it was an attempt to create a standard computer platform for Japan's many PC brands which lacked software compatibility. Kind of like the IBM PC, MSX was sold by Sony along with dozens of other companies, including Panasonic, Mitsubishi, Canon, Toshiba, Hitachi, Casio, Fujitsu, and so on and on and on. The first 2 Metal Gear games and the first Final Fantasy were among some of the notable games released for MSX, but it was a computer standard, and so Sony had very little to do with the creation of the MSX.
The Society Against PlayStation.
Game budgets weren't the only thing that grew. Marketing for the PlayStation and its games expanded significantly and included a lot of TV commercials.
Yes, friends, I'm talking about this.
For all you Gen Z and Alpha, commercials were ads for television, and it was what everyone watched before YouTube and the internet. I can remember lots of funny Crash Bandicoot commercials. This one was my favorite because he's outside of Nintendo's offices taunting Mario with a megaphone.
Hey, plumber boy, mustache man, your worst nightmare has arrived. I got a little surprise for you.
Final Fantasy VII's marketing budget was $80 million, almost twice the game's development budget, and its commercial was done like a movie trailer. They even got the guy who did all of the voiceovers for every movie trailer.
Come to a theater near you. Final Fantasy VII.
They even had a partnership with Pepsi. Every 24-pack of Pepsi cans had Cloud on the motorcycle. But for Resident Evil 2, Capcom tried to outdo everyone. They hired Dawn of the Dead director George Romero to create a live-action short film starring a fresh-faced Brad Renfro as Leon Kennedy. And speaking of film, in 1995, the movie Hackers had a scene that revolved around the 2 lead characters, played by Johnny Lee Miller and Angelina Jolie, competing on a PlayStation featuring Wipeout, the futuristic racing game from British studio Psygnosis. In 2001, Angelina would go on to play as Lara Croft in the big-budget Tomb Raider movie. And the game movies would keep coming. Also in 2001, Final Fantasy The Spirits Within would be the first ever photorealistic CGI animated movie, and the first Resident Evil movie was released in 2002. The rise of video game movies further demonstrates PlayStation's impact. Today, when we think of the cutting-edge graphics in gaming, the PC master race is likely the focal point, and it's been that way for decades now. But in the early 90s, they didn't have graphics cards the way we know them today. Video Graphics Array, or VGA cards, added video memory space for more colors and higher resolutions. Games for Microsoft's MS-DOS or Windows had to be written manually in code that would be run in the CPU and then sent to the VGA display hardware, and then animated in the frame buffer with page flipping the same exact way the PlayStation does. In 1992, Sega's AM1 arcade systems pioneered 3D games with Virtua Racing. followed in 1993 by Virtua Fighter, but this was only possible on expensive purpose-built hardware. While nowhere near as powerful as arcade machines, PCs did have the competitive edge against the consoles, and in 1995 most PC games were still using pre-rendered environments and sprites, albeit with more colors and resolution than 4th gen consoles, including games like LucasArts' The Dig and Origin's Crusader No Remorse, as well as real-time strategies such as Blizzard's Warcraft 2 and Command & Conquer from Westwood. However, there were a few standout games, and they could manage limited 3D via software, such as Interplay's Descent, a first-person 3-axis 3D game that used portal rendering to efficiently display a 3D environment. Also in 1995 there was BioForge, which sported 3D character models. And then there was MechWarrior 2, which I can remember playing on a potato of a computer with absolutely no textures because there was no 3D hardware. And for that brief period in time, PlayStation, the N64, and to some extent the Sega Saturn held an actual lead over PC games. In 1995, most homes didn't have a computer because of how prohibitively expensive they were. With the release of Windows 95, we'd get DirectX 1.0, but the Direct 3D API wouldn't be released until 96. Also in 96, the first successful 3D GPU was released by 3DFX, a company founded by ex-Silicon Graphics employees. The 3DFX Voodoo, designed only for 3D and lacked any 2D functionality whatsoever, meaning it had to be paired with a separate VGA card. However, by 1997, the NVIDIA Riva and ATI Rage lines, along with Windows Direct 3D API, had given PC the edge in performance, but still nowhere near the market cap of the PlayStation. After the Nintendo and Sony deal ended, we never got a Nintendo Philips machine. The only thing that came out of that partnership was a few Nintendo-branded games produced for the Philips CDI, which I had never seen or heard of before researching for this video. CDI itself is actually a data disk format and a standard, ironically co-developed by Philips and Sony, who despite being arch-enemies, worked together to develop various CD standards, probably partially because Sony had recently lost the Betamax VHS format war with JVC, and by cooperating on a standard, both companies would profit. The N64 came out at a time when it was clear that discs were being embraced by the gaming industry. My real question was, why didn't the N64 use discs? In 1994, they made it clear they were going with cartridges, citing speed and performance as key factors. Cartridge storage was only 8 megabytes versus Sony's discs, which were 650 megabytes each, would eventually become 64 megabytes thanks to improvements in solid-state technology, game-changing for the N64, but still far shy of discs. Nintendo also claimed durability was a concern with this. It's also likely that Nintendo feared piracy as writable CDs would become a commodity by the late 90s. Sega Saturn would check a disk's validity right as it powered on, meaning you could start it up with a genuine Saturn game inside, and then switch it out for a pirated game that would play with no issue. PlayStation was a little more complex and included cryptography checking of the disks. You could only get around by chipping the console, which meant opening it up and soldering another board inside of it. There were other drawbacks, the biggest one being each cartridge is a piece of computer hardware with a board and chips, and costs far more time and money to make. Some of them were more complex than others. The game makers would earn less money for each game sold on the N64 versus the PlayStation. But the N64 did have an interesting upgrade path that may have bridged that gap, including the expansion pack, which doubled its RAM to 8 megabytes and was necessary for Donkey Kong 64, Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, and Perfect Dark. Other games would get improved resolutions and rendering at longer distances with the expansion pack. The 64DD was an expansion floppy disk drive that would allow the N64 to use a proprietary 64 megabyte magnetic disc for expanded and rewritable data storage, a real-time clock for persistent game world design, and a standard font and audio library for further storage efficiency. But it was only released in Japan and it was a commercial failure. For PlayStation to be successful, Sony needed games. Nintendo and Sega held the keys to the console kingdom with partnerships and distribution deals. In the 90s, there was a lot of focus on bringing arcade games to the home console, and Sega was also a major player in the arcade market. Plus, both companies had their own franchises like Mario and Sonic. Because Sony was a huge name in electronics and entertainment, lots of the game makers wanted to work with them. What better way to get back at Nintendo than teaming up with their biggest partners? Big names like Namco, Midway, Capcom, and Konami, who also made their own arcade games, as well as the console and computer names like Squaresoft, Enix, Psygnosis, Electronic Arts, and Activision. PlayStation launched with a diverse catalog of games such as Namco's Tekken, a 3D arcade fighter ported to the PlayStation where it would become a huge success, especially with its follow-up sequels. Street Fighter from Capcom was already a widely popular franchise and made a key selling point for PlayStation. Ridge Racer, originally released in 1993 on Namco's System 22 arcade machines, was a cutting-edge racing game, the first ever to use texture mapping and garage shading. Its PlayStation port had impressive graphics despite not being as detailed, but you didn't notice if they weren't side by side. Twisted Metal was a demolition derby vehicular combat game created by US studio Singletrack, specifically for Sony. And while it may not have had the greatest graphics, it began a new franchise with 3 successful sequels, and I used to play Twisted Metal 2 and 3 with my mom all the time, and it was probably the only PlayStation game we ever played together. But it's fond memories nonetheless. Ubisoft's Rayman is a side-scrolling 2D platformer, but it incorporated hand-drawn 60Hz animation and even ray tracing, which gave it standout appearance and a cult following. This wide variety of early games were crucial to its early success, but it was the following wave of original games that would define the PlayStation, setting new trends instead of following them. The 5th generation of gaming consoles were all unique, simply for the fact that they represent a pivotal time in graphics hardware and development. 3D rendered games were the goal, but there was no clear path set to reaching that destination. Many of the PlayStation's landmark games used a sort of mixed approach, often referred to as 2.5D rather than 3D. The first 3 Resident Evil games are a perfect example of this, with their use of pre-rendered images to make up the environments. This consists of 2D images created by a graphics designer, with 3D character models rendered on top. This approach was particularly effective because it meant you could cut down on your programming time while also conserving precious CPU cycles that would be dedicated to your 3D characters and enemies, as well as environmental details such as fire, or even dynamic lighting, such as you can see here, where the zombies have the glow of the fire projected onto them. As the character moved, the camera angle would switch, and this creates a very cinematic experience as well. It also simplified a core issue to early 3D development known as the visibility problem, which is about ensuring that things that aren't supposed to be visible from the viewport are hidden. PlayStation's approach to this is called an ordering table, a dedicated table where each entry is indexed using a depth value. Dealing with this is much simpler in a game like Resident Evil 2 because of the fixed camera position. Additionally, there's perspective added. The models are drawn smaller or larger as they move relative to the viewport. In this example, Leon moves behind the countertops in the shop because the image is stacked This simple technique is very effective at making the flat image environments seem like 3D spaces. Here we have Capcom's unfinished Resident Evil 2, commonly called Resident Evil 1.5. It was scrapped entirely very late into its development, but it's a great example because it lacks the visibility masks and layers. Here Leon is drawn over what should be a concrete wall in the stairs, and here the zombie appears out of thin air without being hidden around the hallway corner. It's such a simple and elegant way to bring realistic and detailed worlds to life, and seeing behind the curtain just makes me appreciate it more, to be honest. But PlayStation's epic cinematic games weren't limited to pre-rendered backgrounds and 2.5D designs. Often compared with Resident Evil. Silent Hill from 1999 is another great example of a cinematic survival horror game. Konami, the creators of Silent Hill, fully embrace PlayStation's 3D capability. The environments are fully rendered, and even more impressive is the real-time lighting and effects and the dynamic camera that moves with the character. Silent Hill places you in a wide open town where you're free to roam. It's in stark contrast with the messy, crowded streets of Raccoon City that are filled with enemies and only allow you to progress in a linear path, divided up into sections with cleverly disguised loading screens as door-opening animations. Silent Hill is wide open, neat and orderly, and eerily quiet. Dynamic fog and falling snow disguises the PlayStation's hardware limitations and cleverly solves the visibility issue. Objects and buildings in the distance appear out of the fog rather than suddenly appearing out of thin air. The pre-rendered backgrounds of Resident Evil storyboard, the chaos that took place before you got there, pileups of city buses and wrecked cars, convey an environmental story, augmented via the many notes and diaries you can find laying around. The environment of Silent Hill is the entire opposite. It's all about the present and what's happening to your character right now. Looking at your surroundings will leave you with more questions than answers. Like, what happened to the road? It's been just completely destroyed, and yet most of the town looks perfectly fine. In this early sequence, our protagonist Harry is chasing his daughter through the open streets, then into a more claustrophobic alleyway. Once in the alleyway, suddenly we have a switch to both fixed and dynamic camera angles. Harry even runs into the wall, matching the disorientation of the player, but also because Harry doesn't have the coordination of a cop or a soldier. He's your average guy. The light shifts from overcast to nearly pitch black. Harry pulls out his lighter, and now we have dynamic light. There's excellent use of sound design here as well. We hear things before we see them, like this squeaky wheelchair. Layering audio to build up the tension and suspense. Taking advantage of PlayStation's multi-channel audio system, Silent Hill masterfully uses sound and not being able to see where a sound came from to maintain fear and anticipation. Part of Team Silent, Takayoshi Sato was the character designer solely responsible for the CGI, often sleeping at Konami offices because of the amount of time spent creating Silent Hill's cinematics, probably the most realistic in any game at the time. I can't tell you how insane it is that one man did all the CGI work for this game. In 2025, this might all seem like standard fare, but I assure you that in 1999, it was an experience that was unlike any other. From the music, the atmosphere, the tone, the visual styling, all create an experience that's terrifying and beautiful at the same time. And even today, there's nothing quite like it. Often called the first true 3D platformer game, released in 1996, Crash Bandicoot was essentially PlayStation's counter to Mario or Sonic. Clearly inspired by another Nintendo property, the revolutionary Donkey Kong Country from 1994 for the Super Nintendo, Crash was created by US game studio Naughty Dog, and it was their first major success, showing off the console's full 3D capability with fast-paced, smooth, and addictive levels. And while it may not be as cinematic as Final Fantasy or as realistic as Resident Evil, Crash Bandicoot represents a lot of technical innovation. ARS Technica has an excellent video about the making of Crash that features Naughty Dog co-founder Andy Gavin. He goes into the rationale behind choosing the PlayStation.
And then Sony had this new machine which was like all 3D, very similar to high-end commercial 3D hardware like the Silicon Graphics hardware. I really thought it was the only one of those machines that actually do what we were sort of like aiming at.
He explained that as a way around the limited read and write time of discs, Naughty Dog developers use duplication of the 3D assets that appear across game levels rather than from a single spot on the disc. They also pioneered and patented methods for dynamically swapping out pages of virtual memory without the need for a loading screen. Methods still widely used in modern games to this day. Crash Bandicoot also employed pioneering advances in animation for real-time 3D models, like Crash turning around and smiling at the player while also breaking the fourth wall. Naughty Dog even hired more artists out of concern that too many team members were developers, and strive for Looney Tunes-like animated effects. Along with its sequels and spin-offs, Crash began a best-selling PlayStation franchise that established Naughty Dog as a major game studio, before being acquired in 2001 as part of PlayStation Studios, eventually going on to create multiple Sony exclusives such as Uncharted and The Last of Us. Released in 1996, shortly after the PlayStation's debut in the US, Tomb Raider would be one of the first successful third-party titles. Developed from scratch with its own game engine by Core Design Limited of England and published by Eidos Interactive, it was the first ever third-person 3D action-adventure game. With a $5 million budget, Tomb Raider includes a film-like narrative using full-motion videos that weren't quite as high quality as Resident Evil 2 or Final Fantasy VII, but Tomb Raider stands on its own merits. Lara Croft is one of the first badass boss babes that 1 or 2% of mid-90s aspiring feminists had to look up to, or the first objectified yes mommy for the 97% of teenage boys who would be the game's target audience. She was probably the first pinup girl to never be photographed, one of the most recognizable heroines in gaming culture history. But Lara wasn't the only impressive thing about Tomb Raider. Tomb Raider takes place in booby-trapped ancient structures where you have to explore, solve puzzles, and engage in combat, and it's all fully rendered in stunning 3D. Perhaps most impressive was the revolutionary in-game physics. Lara is capable of gravity-defying acrobatics, and I personally believe she's the inspiration for the stylized combat we'd eventually see in the 1999 film, The Matrix. Her athletic skills make it possible for her to climb through temples and tombs, but also give her the edge to survive combat with the likes of wolves, lions, bats, giant lizards, and yes, even
men with guns.
And sometimes dinosaurs and whatever this is. Tomb Raider was developed for the Sega Saturn, the PlayStation, and the PC simultaneously, and an N64 version was considered but ultimately scrapped when Sony signed a deal that made all of the subsequent sequels PlayStation exclusive titles. Tomb Raider spawned a new genre of games and pioneered new mechanics and physics that's influence can still be seen in games today. Heart of Darkness is a game that you may not have even heard of, and I don't think it receives a lot of credit for how solid of a game it really was. Published by Interplay and outside of North America, Infogrames, Heart of Darkness was created by famed French developer Eric Chahi, famous for his 1991 cinematic action-adventure platformer Another World. Another World is widely regarded as one of the most influential games in history, and Heart of Darkness shares a lot in common with it. It tells the story of a young boy who travels through a portal to another dimension when his dog is pulled into the sky during an eclipse. The animation is on par with something like a Pixar or DreamWorks kids film. While it's technically a 2D side-scrolling platformer-style game, it used the capabilities and freedom granted by PlayStation's hardware to present this traditional style in a very compelling new way. And I can't recommend enough, if you've never played this game, you should definitely give it a try, because Heart of Darkness is a true PlayStation classic. Another game that used the traditional side-scrolling platformer approach is Oddworld: Abe's Odyssey. Released in 1997, developed by Oddworld Inhabitants Inc., the studio founded by Lorne Lanning, who had previously worked in film and commercials doing special effects and computer animation. The fictional world is fleshed out with over half a dozen alien and animal species. The story begins in an industrial meatpacking facility, where you play as Abe, who discovers that his enslaved race of people called Mudokons are about to become the meat in the company's new product. Like Heart of Darkness, Oddworld is two-dimensional and could easily have been dismissed as outdated when compared to other fifth-generation titles. But thanks to Lanning's filmmaking skills and PlayStation's hardware, Abe's Odyssey had a cutting-edge look, more impressive than most 3D titles, backed up by a ton of unique gameplay elements that make Oddworld unlike anything else. Abe must solve physical puzzle obstacles, avoiding drops, bombs, guards, and machinery, while also attempting to rescue as many of his people as possible by using an impressive vocabulary of communication and commands.
Hello. Follow me. Okay. Wait. Okay. Hello. Follow me. Wait.
Abe can direct his fellow Mudokons to checkpoints where he can chant to open portals. Chanting is also Abe's powerful weapon, with which he can kill or take possession of guards called Sligs, who, unlike Abe, are all armed with machine guns. Outside the meatpacking plant are the homelands of various other Oddworld species, each filled with unique enemies, obstacles, and challenges that Abe must adapt to and overcome to survive. Because of its unique story, environments, and challenging gameplay, Oddworld became one of the top-selling titles for the PlayStation. In 1998, Konami released Metal Gear Solid, famously created by self-aggrandizing game artist Hideo Kojima. The fourth game in the series, but the first one to be released in North America. It was the first 3D Metal Gear. In fact, everything is 3D. Even the cutscenes are pre-rendered in the game engine rather than using full motion video. Was met with universal acclaim, including accolades such as, "It's less a video game and more a work of art," "A cinematic masterpiece," "The best reason to own a PlayStation." This praise was gradually converted by Kojima's mind into a mental growth hormone, causing his head to expand to a point nearing rupture that would eventually lead to him creating Death Stranding, But that doesn't change the fact that Metal Gear Solid absolutely was an extremely ambitious cinematic action espionage thriller, unlike anything that had come before it. You don't simply run and gun down enemies, instead you're forced to use stealth. In many ways it's like a strategy game. The top-down view is a carryover from the previous Metal Gear games. So you have limited vision, and you'll rely on Snake's futuristic radar to see enemies and security systems to avoid their field of view. You'll actually rely on items like chaff grenades, thermal vision, various explosives and other items to get you through secure militarized compounds full of guards, cameras, and sensors. Holding the triangle button gives you a first-person view. This was the first game I can recall having a real-time third and first-person mechanic outside of car-based games like Gran Turismo or Twisted Metal. Metal Gear Solid is also extremely story-oriented with a ton of dialogue.
Furthermore, since the end of the Cold War,
both gameplay instructions and key story information are conveyed to the player via conversations Snake has using burst codec communication with a large cast of characters.
Just as I expected. You'll have to take the elevator to the surface.
It's an interesting way to move the story forward, but I can remember skipping a ton of this when I was a kid. And it's easily some of the best voice acting in a game from this time, unlike some others I could mention.
Is that you, Jill?
Hi, Barry. You sound strange.
I think I'm getting old. I think I'll go out and get some fresh air for a change.
Barry, something must have happened to you. Am I wrong?
You're not wrong, Jill, but you're not right either. The script, dialogue, and subject matter, virtually unmatched by other games of the time, wouldn't be out of place in a Tom Clancy novel. Metal Gear Solid also added an element of science fiction to its cloak and dagger intrigue, and few games had so much attention paid to the writing. And while I'm not above poking fun at Kojima, I do appreciate and respect him. He saw in the PlayStation the opportunity to tell compelling stories in a way that took the writing seriously, and believed the player was worthy of a game that played like a cinematic thriller. Metal Gear Solid proved Kojima a legendary creator, and it's easily one of the PlayStation's most revolutionary and influential games. One genre particularly revolutionized by PlayStation was driving simulators and racing games. Released in 1997, Gran Turismo was developed and published from within Sony Computer Entertainment's Japan studio by the team that would eventually be spun off into Polyphony Digital. Gran Turismo eventually became the #1 selling game on the console and received critical acclaim not only for its graphics, but its sophisticated and believable physics, featuring a huge selection of real-world cars and brands, and a dedication to driving simulator realism, requiring you to qualify for licenses before racing. There were even special controller systems sold by brands like Mad Catz that included a steering wheel, pedals, and a shifter. And Gran Turismo was often referred to as the greatest racing game of all time by critics. Well, you knew we'd get here eventually. You can't talk about the story of the PlayStation without talking about Final Fantasy VII. From its opening scene, I knew this was going to be a truly epic experience. A green-eyed girl in an alleyway with flowers, busy streets that are familiar yet alien looking at the same time. Seeing the giant city of Midgar, it felt like the entire game could take place here. Oh wait. It actually does in the remake, but you spend a lot of time helping kids and cats. Pretty exciting. But in 1997, Midgard didn't even take up half of the first disc. As we zoom back in on another part of the city, we see flashes of a speeding train, and you can just feel the anticipation. Here it is. This is it. This is gonna be wild. This is gonna be
What the hell is even that?
Why are they so tiny? They didn't look like this on the back of the case. Okay, this is more like it, and...
No! God! No! No!
What the fuck is this shit? You click attack to attack? Is this fun? Is this supposed to be fun? The combat system wasn't exactly what I had in mind. Like many other people, this would be the first RPG I ever played, and had it been something else, I might have written off RPGs altogether. However, it made a positive first impression because Final Fantasy VII is greater than the sum of its parts. Sure, at first the pint-sized mini-character models seem silly, but all that changes when you enter a battle which takes place in arenas fully rendered in 3D. The characters become far more detailed, and the attacks and spells were absolutely impressive in 1997. And there's such a huge variety of enemies that you never know what to expect when you encounter a new one. There is no voice acting, as the story is told through text, which gives it an almost novel-like quality. The simplistic, pint-sized character models are well contrasted by the grand scale and detail of the environments. The soundtrack alone consists of 85 tracks spanning more than 4.5 hours and composed by Nobuo Uematsu, who had planned to use the PlayStation CD track capabilities. However, to improve loading speeds, real-time generated music was chosen instead, which makes the soundtrack even more distinctive. Final Fantasy VII's story is told across 3 discs using a variety of visual styles, complemented by over 43 minutes of epic cinematic full-motion video, animated by digital artists from both the US and Japan, including several Hollywood effects veterans who had worked on blockbusters such as Star Wars, Jurassic Park, and Terminator 2. The pre-rendered environments vary from intimate set pieces to vast, imposing industrial nightmares. Some are picturesque, like a still painting, while others are brought to life with intricate animations and details. Details like flickering or pulsating light, billowing smoke, and spinning windmills that make these so much more than still images. Final Fantasy VII's over 700 animated pre-rendered environments were designed with 3D modeling software running on SGI Onyx supercomputers and workstations, the only hardware that was capable of rendering them at such high detail. They were then converted to 320 by 224 pixel images, fleshed out by compositing the animated segments on top of them. The seamless transitions from gameplay to CGI video and right back into gameplay happen constantly without a single loading screen. The entire game just flows, thanks to efficient management of data. This flow remains true for the tone of the game as you literally travel around the world and back again, going from tense action thriller to lighthearted and comical side quests, and then to dark, esoteric, cosmic horror. Final Fantasy VII was only possible because of the PlayStation, and I could spend an entire video trying to explain to you why this is one of the greatest games ever made, but the only way you'll understand is to play it for yourself. Final Fantasy VII wasn't Square's only cinematic masterpiece. When discussing the advent of big-budget cinematic games, it would be criminal negligence to ignore Parasite Eve. In the shadow of Final Fantasy VII, Parasite Eve feels forgotten, but don't be fooled, it's every bit as epic and grandiose. Instead of epic fantasy, it's an action-packed thrill ride, like a Michael Bay summer blockbuster film. Whenever I mention this game to someone who had never heard of it, I love showing them this prologue that would play before you even got to the start screen. Everyone I ever showed it to was instantly enthralled, saying something along the lines of, "Holy shit, that looks awesome." And it is. Parasite Eve was Squaresoft attempting to get in on the survival horror success of Resident Evil, but mixed with the turn-based RPG-style combat, which may have scared off some of the more casual players. Like Final Fantasy VII, it uses pre-rendered environments, however the art style is far more realistic. Also, like Final Fantasy VII, it contains over 20 minutes of impressive CGI full-motion video and a unique soundtrack. Parasite Eve is Squaresoft's first M-rated title. Based loosely on the Japanese novel of the same name by Hideaki Sina, the game takes place in New York City years after the events of the book. Eve is an entity capable of controlling the DNA of virtually any living thing, mutating plants or animals into monsters. You play as NYPD officer Aya Brea. When Eve sets the entire audience of the opera ablaze, Aya is the only one unaffected because she too has unique DNA that gives her resistance to Eve's power along with powers of her own. This early area always stuck with me because I think it was the first time I'd ever seen the character's reflection in a video game, something that even games today will often leave out because of how costly it is in regards to performance. Here's Cyberpunk, one of the most AAA games in recent history, and even it doesn't use active mirrors. And I even looked into this. GiantBomb.com has a 128 game list that have functional mirrors. An in-game mirror must display the character as they move in order to qualify. Parasite Eve was released in 1998 and it's 14th on the list. King's Quest IV on Atari ST and Commodore Amiga computers from 1988 takes first place, but it wasn't even 3D. Time Crisis from 1995 is a 3D title, but it's an arcade machine rail shooter. So I'm definitely going to call this a win for PlayStation. In Parasite Eve, these real-time mirrors were achieved by inverting and rendering Aya's character model twice, something PlayStation was capable of doing with polygons or even full-motion video as seen here in this developer demo. Did you notice the locker doors aren't open in the reflection? Parasite Eve is a game unlike any other, and it's yet another landmark achievement for PlayStation. It was followed by a sequel 2 years later, featuring a completely overhauled combat system, further improved graphics, and its own unique story. I'd highly recommend both of these games, but they're only available on the original PlayStation and the PlayStation Vita. But we'll talk about the wonders of emulation a little bit later. Between 1996 and 2001, Squaresoft released a prolific 25 games for the PlayStation, 10 of which were in the top 120 best-selling list. In 1999, Square would release the 8th installment in the Final Fantasy anthology and go on to sell 8.6 million copies. With such high expectations from its predecessor, Final Fantasy VIII ups the ante in just about every way, even adding a fourth disc, featuring a story that somehow manages to be more complex than Final Fantasy VII's, larger and far more intricate cities, set pieces, and locations, more detailed and realistic character models complete with rendered textures, enemy difficulties that are on a sliding scale according to how you play, and even more beautiful CGI full motion videos. This is definitely the Final Fantasy that doesn't get enough love. I could go on forever about this game, but suffice it to say, Final Fantasy VIII has its own unique identity, and it might even tie with 7 for my favorite Final Fantasy game. In July of 2000, we'd get Final Fantasy IX. With over 5 million copies sold, it would make the top-selling list once again. It would be nothing like Final Fantasy VII or VIII, instead returning to a style more similar to the pre-PlayStation Final Fantasy games. With its medieval steampunk aesthetic and a strong fantasy art style, it still manages to push the technological progression. In particular, the use of animation composited into pre-rendered environments is done very well in this game. The new world is immersive and fleshed out, with a story featuring plenty of epic sequences to rival 7 and 8. With Final Fantasy IX, Square managed to subvert the expectations, returning to its roots while avoiding any sense of repetition. The amount of creativity and work it takes to put out 3 games so large and in such a short amount of time is just astounding. Also in 2000, just a few months before Final Fantasy IX, Squaresoft released Vagrant Story. While it's still an RPG and not as beloved as Square's other series, Vagrant Story is notable as a groundbreaking departure in terms of graphics and dynamics for Squaresoft, including adding detailed and animated facial expressions during real-time cutscenes, something not attempted even by 3D veterans like Konami. Abandoning their signature pre-rendered backgrounds for a fully rendered 3D design, adding physical challenges like climbing and jumping to traverse 3D topography, and even a first-person view of your surroundings. It was the last new game developed by Square for PlayStation and shows their proficiency with the hardware. I've always thought of this game like a Squaresoft beta test of their next-gen techniques, because it basically previews the approach that they would take with most of their PlayStation 2 games. Capcom's 1996 survival horror hit Resident Evil was a cornerstone PlayStation title. Its 3-year development was mired by both technical and conceptual setbacks. Initially planned for Super Nintendo as a supernatural horror adventure game, and later as a first-person shooter inspired by Doom. Director Shinji Mikami drew inspiration from American horror films like Dawn of the Dead and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Mikami was the only person working on it for several months, but as Capcom became more interested, the game became their primary focus, and the team would eventually grow to 80 people. When Mikami saw the 1992 horror game Alone in the Dark, his mind was made up. Resident Evil would be third person with pre-rendered environments to give it horror film camera angles. Both Sega Saturn and PlayStation were considered, but PlayStation became the target platform because its hardware was better suited for the game. However, Resident Evil would eventually be ported to Windows before the end of 1996 and to the Saturn in 97. It included several distinctive features, such as a choice between 2 playable characters.
Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine.
Chris moves faster and has more health. Jill gets an extra 2 inventory slots and a lockpick, and she has access to more weapons. Inventory space is a crucial aspect of the game, and your saves are limited by the number of ink ribbons you have, which takes up its own inventory slot. Resident Evil had a way of keeping the player on their toes. The unsettling soundtrack becomes more tense when a new threat arises out of nowhere. Even the boss fights can come out of nowhere. This added to the anticipation at each loading screen door. And you could also be surprised in a room you'd already passed through several times. Like most major PlayStation titles, Resident Evil included several minutes of full-motion videos for key points in the story's progression. For the most important scene, the game's opening, American actors were filmed in Japan for what was basically a live-action short film. The in-game dialogue uses different voice actors, and it wasn't exactly worthy of an Oscar.
Oh, Barry!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
It was a critical and commercial success far beyond Capcom's projections. By 1997, it had 4 million copies sold, earning over $200 million against an estimated budget of around $1 million.
Damn you!
It can't control what it does.
Work on a sequel began only a month after Resident Evil's release, and would be out just under 2 years later in 1998. With the success of the first game, the team was expanded and given a much larger budget. The results were a masterpiece that improved and expanded the original formula in almost every way.
What are these things?
The visual quality alone looks like it's running on different hardware. The pre-rendered environments, character models, and enemy models are exponentially better looking. The max number of zombies in an area was increased to 7, and more enemy types were added. Story and narrative are a much larger part of Resident Evil 2. This time, each character would get their own disc, one for Leon and one for Claire, but with 2 scenarios each. An A and B story and a zapping system that changes depending on which character you played first and choices you made, and a total of 4 possible endings. This meant far more replayability options. If you complete the game with Leon, you're given a save file titled Claire B. In Claire's B scenario, the exploded tanker truck will be on your left. You'll enter the police station a totally different way. You'll also get a surprise in the form of the Tyrant, or Mr. X, who is slow but hits hard and cannot be killed. Not nearly as terrifying as in the remake, but this would really catch you off guard. Capcom took the CGI animation to a whole new level with 40 minutes of professional full-motion video between both discs, genuinely capturing the detail, color, and lighting of major horror films. I don't think there was more realistic CGI in any game from 1998, hands down. From a horror standpoint, Resident Evil 2 is far more effective than its predecessor. The pacing is totally different. Instead of the slow-burning mystery of the empty Spencer mansion, you're dropped into the war zone that is Raccoon City, full of zombies, finding safe haven only when you reach the gun store with another living person sticking a gun in your face. The Spencer Mansion delivered plenty of surprise scares, but seeing someone else eaten alive is effective in a totally different way. Another thing I always found truly disturbing was the zombies continue to pile onto your body after you die. I mean, that's just wrong. Finally, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis from 1999 also must be mentioned. While not genre-defining like the original and not as groundbreaking as its sequel, it's still one of PlayStation's highest-selling games, and Capcom managed to squeeze even more performance out of the console, with more realistic full-motion videos, even more zombies on screen, and more intricate environments. Despite having only one playable character, RE3 mixes it up with quick-time events that dramatically change your circumstances moving forward. The choices also affect which one of two endings you'll get. You reprise the role of Jill Valentine, and spend a lot more time on the chaotic streets of Raccoon City, brought to life with burst fire hydrants and more dynamic obstacles like fires you'll have to put out to cross. Gameplay was further enhanced with the ability to dodge and quickly turn around. You could shoot explosive barrels and create ammo using the reloading tool. But most notable is the prime antagonist. Nemesis makes Mr. X and William Birkin seem friendly by comparison, and adds a whole new level of anxiety. He's faster than any other boss, and he ambushes you out of nowhere. But the biggest shock comes when you realize that he can follow you through doors. This game caused me genuine stress and anxiety as a kid. Playing it would make my ears turn red and hot, which caused my mother to be concerned, and concern wasn't really her thing. Despite being shorter than Resident Evil 2, Nemesis has more significant events and locations by far. Without a doubt, it has the best ending of the first three games, and the progression from the first Resident Evil to Nemesis is an example of Capcom learning how to produce amazing games for the PlayStation and created a lasting franchise that's earned billions of dollars. So what if you want to play the classics today? Sure, lots of them are available on the PS4, PS5 through PlayStation Network. There's PC ports of some, and some are even on Steam. But a lot of the classic games like Parasite Eve aren't available on any modern platform, and buying physical copies can be pricey. Not to mention, you're going to need an HDMI converter to get your console connected to a modern TV. Emulation is one way to go, but downloading games is in a gray area legally, and I can't advise you on such matters.
You never make things easy, do you?
What I can tell you is there are some benefits to emulation. This is Fear Effect 2 running on DuckStation. The 3D polygons of the playable characters are improved thanks to techniques that were absent from the real hardware. But Fear Effect games both used full motion videos for everything else, and the quality there kind of suffers. There's lots of emulators to choose from, and lots of configurable options, and even custom shaders. I use DuckStation on Linux, and my PS5 controller works perfectly. Some other benefits are the ability to save and pause anywhere, faster loading, and even fast forwarding. Plus, all of the cheats built right into the emulator. And in making this documentary, I've spent a lot of time learning not just about the PlayStation's hardware, but the N64, the Saturn, even the 3DO, and this entire period in gaming as a whole. I read forums, developer documentation, and interviews, took hundreds of notes, but I've decided this needs to be a part of the video. Basically, we're going to look at the other 5th generation consoles. The 5th gen console war kicked off with 3 American systems in 1993. Amiga CD32 from Commodore, Atari Jaguar, and the 3DO. Under false advertising, it claimed to be a 64-bit system. Oh, and I should clarify, 32-bit versus 64-bit is not nearly as important as console manufacturers made it out to be. The jump from 16-bit to 32-bit, however, was a massive difference because 16-bit processors can only address 64 kilobytes of RAM. Jaguar used cartridges, and later Jaguar CD was released using a Motorola 68K CPU and its Tom and Jerry graphics and audio chips. The Tom chip included an object processor for sprites, bitmaps, and backgrounds, and a blitter. The blitter was pioneered by the Commodore Amiga computer in 1985, capable of drawing millions of pixels very quickly for textures. Much of Jaguar's 3D was achieved via complicated programming because it lacked a hardware rasterizer, and developers struggled to use it effectively. While it had some ambitious titles, including Wolfenstein 3D and Alien vs. Predator, it sold less than 150,000 units and was basically the end of Atari. The 3DO was a 32-bit disc-based console designed by the 3DO Company, an American brand started by Electronic Arts founder Trip Hawkins with a price of $699. 3DO didn't build or sell the console, but licensed it to brands like Panasonic, Gold Star, and Sanyo. 3DO used a custom ARM60 RISC CPU with 2 megs of main RAM and 1 meg of VRAM for the Clio data processor and Madam address engine. Both of its primary engineers worked on Amiga desktop designs and later for Atari on the Lynx handheld. For 1993, it had impressive graphics and could even do full-motion video, but most of its games were available on more affordable platforms. Although Jurassic Park Interactive was its big exclusive title, it was not well received by critics. Need for Speed on 3DO I think actually looks better than both the Saturn or PlayStation versions. The space rail shooter style game Starblade has surprisingly good graphics that to me stand out more than any of the other titles. And looking into it further, I discovered 3DO's unique approach to 3D was its cell rendering engine. The name refers to cell animation, the traditional technique used to create old films like Snow White. Cells were neither polygons nor sprites, but used transparency to achieve 3D in software by applying textures to 2D surfaces that are clipped off screen. And in my research, I constantly found people on forums claiming PlayStation only succeeded because it was so simple, that a particular console was superior, and this sentiment is associated with the 3DO, but far more so with the Sega Saturn. And so I wanted to know, was Sega the more powerful system? Sega Saturn had a whopping total of 8 processors with 512 kilobytes more VRAM than PlayStation. Its dual 32-bit Hitachi SH2 CPUs were also found in the 32X Genesis Mega Drive upgrade and shared 2 megs of RAM with a coprocessor called the Saturn Control Unit. VDP1 and 2 each have their own 512 kilobytes of VRAM. VDP1 also has 512 kilobytes of dedicated frame buffer, a Motorola 68K and custom Saturn sound processor with another 512 kilobytes for audio, and finally a Hitachi SH1 dedicated to controlling the disc, plus a slot for the video CD cartridge that would improve video quality in games that supported it and allowed Saturn to play video CDs, a precursor to DVDs. Worried about their competition, Sega pressed Hitachi for more performance out of the dual CPUs. Still unsatisfied with 3D performance, they finally added the Saturn Control Unit, a vector geometry accelerator akin to PlayStation's geometry transformation engine, but the SCU ran at half the speed of the CPUs while also accessing main memory, making it a nightmare to use. This caused many developers to ignore it entirely and instead use the SH2s to process all geometry. Looking at its board, Saturn's hardware looks most complex, with PlayStation in the middle and N64 appearing the simplest. And I'm sure this will offend Saturn fans, but I can now say with total confidence, Saturn was not more powerful than the PlayStation when it comes to 3D. It could theoretically draw more pixels, and it's possibly capable of more instructions per second, but that doesn't make up for its lack of 3D acceleration in any way. Saturn came from the same team who developed the System 32 arcade boards. Head of Saturn Research and Development, Hideki Sato, is quoted saying he regrets not going with the Sega Model 1 hardware as a base, but they were concerned about leaving all of the developers behind that were focused on sprites rather than 3D. Saturn fans often say developers didn't understand Saturn, or they didn't take the time to use it correct, possibly because VDP-1 is solely responsible for 3D and it renders quadrilateral primitives instead of triangles. Both the 3DO and the Saturn, in quite different ways, used quadrilaterals in a time before 3D had standardized. Quads had advantages for flat surfaces and sometimes perspectives, but Saturn used them because they were simpler to understand for developers coming from Super Nintendo and Genesis. But there's a reason triangles became standard. They are more efficient for 3D math, period. Saturn fans refute this, citing NVIDIA's first NV1 3D graphics chip, which also used quads. But NVIDIA in 1995 was not the industry leader we know today, and the NV1 was not well received. The final blow to quads was dealt when Microsoft made DirectX triangle exclusive, rendering them obsolete. Saturn's VDP-2 is an exceedingly powerful 2D processor that draws and manipulates planes. It also has to draw the frame buffer from VDP-1 into 1 or 2 dedicated 3D planes, with an additional 4 available for its 2D work. This worked pretty well for character models in games like Resident Evil, where 3D is minimal. Still, there are indications of Saturn struggling to keep up, such as sound glitches and loading screens that are noticeably longer. In certain angles, Resident Evil even looks better on Saturn, but in head-on angles like this, PlayStation looks much better. When porting Quake, Lobotomy began with Saturn as their base, but they eventually tested a PlayStation port and were shocked to find that it could run at 60 frames per second on PlayStation versus 15 to 20 frames per second on Saturn. The PlayStation port was never finished because they never found a publisher. Lobotomy's Ezra Dreisbach had this to say about the Saturn. The graphics hardware was made by guys that obviously wanted to just keep developing 2D hardware and tried to avoid learning anything about 3D. They missed key ideas, making some things impossible. They threw a whole bunch of parts in a box, and none of them worked out that great. The second processor in particular made it both more difficult to program and impossible to fully utilize. VDP-2 has color RAM dedicated to converting VDP-1's colors to its own, but Saturn is unable to use half transparency between sprites or polygons. If the two overlap, the bottom sprite disappears entirely. However, VDP-2 can use half transparency for its foreground plane. Another issue is Saturn's forward texture mapping, which has all kinds of drawbacks that aren't a problem in the inverse texture mapping used on PlayStation. Low Scoreboy has a great video that can explain this a lot better than I can, and I highly recommend it. Tomb Raider is a good example where you can really see the visual and performance difference versus PlayStation. Outside the pool, VDP-2 is likely achieving transparency via the uppermost plane, but underwater the difference becomes clear. Differences in color, inconsistent frame rates, and noticeable aliasing are some of the many quirks in the Saturn port. Panzer Dragoon is a Saturn 3D masterpiece. Unlike Tomb Raider, the viewport is fixed and Saturn's architecture is well suited for the arcade rail shooter format. But Saturn's best-selling game, Virtua Fighter 2, is also its best looking, and it's a cornerstone of the Saturn supremacy argument. Running at 60 frames per second with a 704 by 512 resolution, it looks like it's running on completely different hardware. Sega's arcade division, AM2, spent many months achieving this faithful port that also resulted in the Sega Graphics Library, or SGL, which were development tools that enabled devs to make better use of Saturn's hardware without having to write everything out in assembly language. Important in making several Saturn hits possible, such as Nights into Dreams, Sonic R, and Sonic 3D Blast, as well as Sega Rally Championship. Saturn had 1,265 games in Japan and only 258 released in the USA, versus PlayStation's 1,335 in the US and a whopping 3,290 in Japan. RPGs are a strong point where Saturn really shines, with beautiful examples like Albert Odyssey showing off stylish 2D far beyond the Genesis or Super Nintendo. The Shining Force RPGs also made very good use of Saturn's tech. The environments here are all 3D with 2D sprites used for the characters, and it works really well. Some of the combat even happens in 3D similarly to Final Fantasy VII. Grandia is another particularly striking example, the same way many of PlayStation's greatest titles weren't entirely 3D. Titles like these show off Saturn's capabilities, and it's a shame so many of these games never came to the US. Enemy Zero is an interesting survival horror style game that was originally intended for release on PlayStation. This game shows off Saturn's full motion video capabilities with decent CGI for its time. Director Kenji Eno and Warp Games had released Enemy Zero's spiritual prequel, D, on 3DO, PlayStation, and Saturn, and it was well received, but Sony only produced 40,000 copies of a 100,000 copy order by retailers, failing to meet demand, and because of this, Kenji made Enemy Zero Sega exclusive. D, Enemy Zero, and D2 were not traditional games, but more like interactive movies, a game style that was fairly common at the time, heavily relying on CGI woven together with gameplay, but manages to show off how Saturn could compete with PlayStation in terms of cinematic titles. I am gonna give the N64 its due respect and tell you why I think it failed. The N64 truly was more advanced than the PlayStation, partially because it originates from SGI. After purchasing MIPS in 1992, SGI created a low-power system based on their 64-bit MIPS R4200 and a custom SGI GPU intended explicitly to be sold in high volume for home consoles. SGI didn't want to enter the market, but partner with an established name who would become a large-scale customer for their chips. They approached Sega first, who were impressed, but rejected because the Saturn was already well underway, and Nintendo of course accepted, but also denies that Sega passed up the opportunity before them. The N64's MIPS CPU was produced under license by NEC as the VR4300, a 64-bit chip clocked at 93.75 MHz, nearing 3 times the speed of Sony's R3000A based design. But even more impressive was the Reality Coprocessor, or RCP, clocked at 62.25 MHz, considered the first ever programmable GPU, paired with 2 4.5 megabyte chips of cost-effective RD RAM associated with incurred latency for each chip used. And to offset this, the RAM was clocked at a whopping 250 MHz, 2.6 times the speed of the CPU, Also unique is the unified memory architecture, meaning all the memory is shared, and the CPU only sees 4 megabytes because the other half megabyte is reserved for the RCP. The CPU is only connected to the memory through the RCP, so the Reality coprocessor acts as the GPU, but also manages all the memory, the cartridge, all other input-output, and processes the audio. And it does this via 3 sections: Reality Signal Processor, Reality Display Processor, and the Input-Output Manager. The RCP is a lot closer to a modern GPU and added hardware acceleration for all graphics geometry using both triangles and rectangles as primitives. It also includes a color combiner and blender, meaning it can mix more colors and apply more shading effects to the polygons. It also features support for MIP mapping textures, where the textures are stored as a single file optimized for projection at differing distances with lower resolutions. The RCP uses bilinear filtering of textures, which is more advanced than PlayStation's nearest neighbor. Its perspective correction is also superior, meaning you didn't get those distortions we talked about earlier. And it includes a Z buffer that prevents the flickering and disappearing polygons issue while accelerating more accurate lights and shadows. With the RCP literally juggling jobs, the N64's CPU is then free to execute all of the game logic. All of these combinations of jobs relied on microcodes provided from Nintendo or SGI. More about that in a moment. Audio is tricky business for the RCP. In theory, it could handle an unlimited number of channels, but in reality, it's however much is available while also rendering the game. Supposedly, the CPU could be tagged in to play the audio using a different microcode. Because all the data has to run through the RCP, it was typical to lower the sample quality. And so, despite all of the N64's progressive features that made it a very capable 3D system, it was weaker than PlayStation when it comes to media, and specifically images and textures. And the easiest thing to blame for the shortcoming is the small storage of the cartridges. And I wanted to say all the progressive features of the N64 were designed by SGI, and all of its flaws came from Nintendo. But Resident Evil 2 was in fact ported to the N64. Capcom gave $1 million to Angel Studios, and they managed to fit everything onto a single 64 megabyte cartridge by dramatically reducing the quality of all the media assets. All the sounds are lower quality, the full motion videos are lower frame rates, scaled down, all the projected textures and pre-rendered environments are lower in quality and detail. You can see N64's polygons are more solid with smoother edges, but less detailed in texture. This is often blamed on the 4 kilobyte texture cache, but PlayStation's texture cache was only 2 kilobytes. And this brings us back to the microcode. Microcode is the set of instructions for game development packaged for programming the N64, and Nintendo failed to provide third parties additional code that they themselves used for in-house games. And this forced devs to use the 4 kilobyte texture cache, whereas PlayStation's 2 kilobyte texture cache was optional, and the textures could be stored at any size in PlayStation's VRAM. This later changed, and it was access to the custom microcode that made Resident Evil 2 on the N64 possible. I've seen a respected source refer to the N64's memory subsystem as broken. And with that said, a lot of people prefer the N64 version of Resident Evil 2 and N64's games in general. So let's compare some games. Super Mario 64 was N64's best-selling game, and Gran Turismo was PlayStation's best-selling game. But they aren't really comparable, so let's look at Crash Bandicoot. I've already talked about how innovative Crash was as a 3D platformer. Now I'll ask you simply, do you think Mario 64 looks twice as good? Does it seem twice as fun? because to me, these two games look like they could be running on the same hardware. Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time is a big N64 action-adventure style RPG, fully rendered in 3D. It plays on the N64's strengths with interactive locations full of destructible objects and an open-world environment. With dynamic camera views and long-distance rendering, Zelda is a very impressive game that would be difficult to pull off on PlayStation. But it could also be mistaken for a kid's game. Compare that with Final Fantasy VII having a much darker tone and mature themes like identity crisis, terrorism, and even the murder of a female leading character. The story, music, video, and challenging combat make it larger than life. Pre-rendered 2D environments don't hold it back because they're intricate works of art. And purely in terms of scope, it's a blowout. A typical Zelda playthrough is around 10 hours compared to a whopping 36 hours for Final Fantasy VII. Can anyone really say Ocarina of Time is more epic than Final Fantasy VII with a straight face? I admit I am biased, but even my friends who loved their N64s would admit Final Fantasy VII was a seriously impressive and good game. But then the N64 dramatically outshines PlayStation when it comes to first-person shooters like GoldenEye, Perfect Dark, Turok Dinosaur Hunter, and N64 was easily better for multiplayer games. Even so, 4 controller ports was a gimmick in my opinion, because 4-way split even on a decent sized CRT television was never a good experience. The N64 excelled at bringing 3D dynamics to established traditional gameplay, but PlayStation revolutionized narrative-driven and cinematic-style games. Many SGI employees that worked on the Reality coprocessor left SGI before the company's demise, and they went on to found 3D Effects, which launched the first 3D accelerated GPU for PCs, and another 20 of SGI's employees ended up working with ATI to design the Flipper GPU in the Nintendo GameCube. This further demonstrates how incredible PlayStation was, because it managed to defeat not only the two titans of home consoles, but the very company that revolutionized 3D. And they did it with SGI's own MIPS architecture. They designed a powerful yet very simple computer with an in-house GPU that could do the major functions of 3D, brilliantly accelerated with the geometry transformation engine, doing 3D pretty well, but adding the powerful audio, video, and image processing. Sony embraced developers and made affordable development tools for the different roles and budgets. And most importantly, they gave developers the full control of already simple hardware, which allowed them to approach making games in any way they saw fit. Nintendo focused on making their own games using the raw 3D and multiplayer, whereas Sony had a lot more mature games and focused on the cinematic design, narrative, and environment. PlayStation's games had a lasting impact. It changed the industry with the first AAA titles. Hopefully I've made my case for the PlayStation, and I hope you liked the video. It feels so good to finally be done with it. I've been working on it for what feels like forever. If I got something wrong or you disagree, I'm sure there will be some of you that do. Please voice your opinion in the comments down below. I'll try to respond to as many as I can. And if you watch this whole thing, please hit that like button. It helps more people to see it. And if you could share this with people who are into PlayStation or N64, that would also be awesome. And if you're a real G, hit the subscribe button. This is my first documentary style video, and I'm hoping to do more. Oh, and by the way, this entire video was created on Linux. I do a lot of content about Linux and open source software, and increasingly I'm going to try and do more stuff about games, but I cover everything technology and media. Thank you for watching, and for DS Tech Media, I'm Jay, and I hope you'll watch, because you might learn something.